Well, you've been told that ideas are what make the University of Chicago what it is. I taught here from 1968 to 80 in economics and then also in history. And that's certainly true. If it were true of all universities or all academic arguments, science and scholarship would make much faster progress. My claim this afternoon is that the great enrichment of the last couple of centuries or more, from going from $2 a day in Chicago prices right now in 1800 to $50 a day worldwide, a factor of 25 since 1800, and higher, of course, in the United States and Switzerland and other places, was in fact caused by ideas. It was the idea of liberalism. I always stutter on my favorite word. That's the secret sauce. Now, it's an old argument. In the 18th century, the advocates for a free society, a society, as I'm saying these days, of equality of permission, not equality of outcome, which is the socialist ideal, not equality of opportunity, which is the social democratic ideal, but equality of permission to join the race. No artificial hooks and chairs put in your way by the state or by your family or by your institutions. Women can be airline pilots. That's the key idea of people like Adam Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft, Henry David Thoreau, John Stuart Mill, the early liberals in the old sense, not in the strange modern sense. Actually, in both North and South America, the word has come to mean what it doesn't mean. Here in the United States, it means social democratic. You're a liberal if you're on the left. In Latin America, it often means policies that help the rich enforced by the army, neither of which is equality of permission. And I would claim that the texts of the 18th century support this. That if you look closely at what the handful, and then more than a handful of pioneers of the liberal idea were saying, it's about this permission. Not as it became in the late 19th century with the growth of what was known in England as the new liberalism in the 1880s, which was the opposite of the old. It said, no, we're not going to have this equal permission stuff. I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, and I'm going to organize your life, and that's become what most large, modern governments say they intend. So there's this secret sauce, the spring in the mechanical watch, which explains what we're trying to explain. That's not what that diagram's about. I'm going to come to that in a moment. It's not the state. It's not internal improvements. You know, you can say, well, the Erie Canal was a great canal. But if you know American history, you know that the other canals were largely a bust. You can say, well, the Tennessee Valley Authority was a good idea. But along with that were a lot of not so good ideas, like the National Recovery Administration. So it's not the state. It's not our masters who made us rich. And stateism is the great enemy of liberalism. See, I always stutter in the word. I apologize. I don't know. Maybe it's some deep psychological problem I have. It's not institutions either. You'll hear from my dear friend Joe Mokyr and my new acquaintance Jim, that it's institutions, that it's clans, say, or that it's even corporations. And it's not. Because what happened from then to now is not capital accumulation, as is said on the right, so to speak, and not slavery or imperialism, which is said on the left. It's innovation. It's new ideas. For example, the new idea which this university instantiates of the University of Berlin in 1810, the first modern university. I understand, by the way, and here I'm going to shock my colleagues, that there is a distinction now in the economics department where I served between teaching faculty and research faculty. This is an abomination. Von Humboldt wouldn't have liked it. The whole point of a modern college or university, if it's a serious place, Grinnell or something, or Chicago, is to combine the creation of new ideas with the teaching of ideas. That the students and the faculty are on a joint intellectual adventure. And that adventure was created in the 18th century, well beyond the academic world. In fact, the best universities in the 18th century were German, and the professors such as Kant and Hegel tended to trim their sails to the will of the King of Prussia. So, liberty is the secret sauce. Now, I can assert this for my own field of my original special field of British economic history, like my heroine Mae West, a great comedian of an earlier age. I'm fond of saying I was Snow White, but I drifted. I was a standard issue economic historian and a neoclassical economist, Chicago style, and then I drifted. I've been a professor of English and philosophy and other things as well. But what happened in the 18th century was permission to innovate. And this was a novelty. And it was confined to Holland and to England and Scotland for a long time. In France, permission to innovate was, well, no, wait, let's consult l'État. Let's check this out. I'm not quite sure you should build that flour mill. No, let's consult with our bosses in Paris. So it's a new idea because it's a denial. This equality of permission is a denial of hierarchy. Hierarchy came with agriculture. Some of the freest societies that humans have had, Homo sapiens have had, are hunter-gatherer societies, small groups wandering about, easy to exit, maybe not so easy to join, but free. With the invention of agriculture, a farmer or a peasant or a serf is tied to the soil that he's got to cultivate, and he's stuck with his storage facilities for grain, which he has to have for seed for the next year and to eat. And so it was natural that the man with a horse and a sword could say, as Rousseau correctly said, one of the few correct things he said, this man with a sword and a horse could say, this is my land now. You pay me either, we'll call it rents or taxes. Economically speaking, they're the same thing. So what happened was that this ancient system, which characterized every agricultural society, was put in question really for the first time. Now, there were predecessors, I guess I also study on that word, such as John Ball, the priest of the Peasants' Revolt in England in 1681, who was defrocked, needless to say, drawn and quartered, which is a nasty thing. Don't volunteer for being drawn and quartered. For saying this: when Adam delved, which means dug, and Eve span, spinning yarn. When Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? Drawn and quartered. The great Richard Rumboldt in 1685 was permitted. He had been in the English Civil War. He had been a leveler, but long after the Civil War, James II's judges caught up with him, condemned him to be hanged, and from his scaffold in Edinburgh, he was permitted under English law to speak. And he said, I think there is no man born of God above another, for none comes into the world with a saddle on his back, neither any booted or spurred to ride him. That's liberalism. But it was a few priests and a few others who asserted this, and it didn't take. Miraculously, fortunately for us, for all of us, for everyone in the world, it started to take hold, especially in the late 18th century. Abigail Adams sent a famous letter to her husband John in 1776, in June of 1776, saying, don't forget the ladies, by which she meant to say, in this new government you're founding, let's give equality of permission to women. And John probably laughed and threw it aside. But she was a true liberal. But she couldn't flourish. The seal of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, an institution founded in 1780 by the early liberals of the United States, some of them slave owners, says on it in Latin, well, I'm at the University of Chicago, I should say the Latin, sub libertate florent, under liberty, they flourish. But they didn't immediately. It was a long, slow extension of this idea of equality of permission. Meanwhile, there were counterforces, and there still are. These hierarchies, these kings and priests who ruled us before, fell. It's been said that in the 18th century, kings had rights and women had none. Now it's the other way around. Goddamn right. Even trans women. But there are counterforces, and the counterforce is statism. The counterforce is the idea that there are these experts in Washington, in Brussels, in Whitehall, who know better than you how to run your life. And they're here to help you. And that's the defense, both on the right and the left, of the immense size of modern governments. 1910, before the First World War, civilized countries had spent perhaps 10% of national income on the essential purposes of a state. I'm not an anarchist. I believe in states, but small and competent ones. By now in France, 55% of national income is spent through the state. And it's high even here. So there's this turn to statism. And in the spirit of our opening introduction, I'm going to contradict our honored colleague and say that it's not more government or more competent government. I was shocked when Frank Fukuyama said to me a few months ago, you know, what we actually need is more state capacity, more efficient states. That's not what we need. We need smaller states and more modest states. And we need experts who stop pretending that they know what they're doing. The Federal Reserve Board doesn't know what it's doing. If you're not economists, you may say, oh my God, is that true? Yeah, it's true. They have, and here's a short philosophical proof of that. If the guys and gals at the Federal Reserve Board knew what they were doing, why are they telling us? Why don't they go make $1 million on their knowledge of future interest rates and prices? If they're so smart, why aren't they rich? And you'll notice that they're not rich. So, the state's not it. Institutions, as I would argue in detail, are often a very mixed bag. Universities themselves, as much as I spent my whole career at universities, I love them. I love the von Humboldt idea of 1810. They can be conservative institutions, and usually are. We're fond of saying that the European university came with the University of Bologna. No, it didn't. That was a trade school for doctors who didn't know what they were doing, theologians who often didn't know what they were doing. It was not a modern university. So it's not the state, it's not institutions, it's ethics. It's such a simple thing as what your mother taught you. Be a good boy. There are some of our politicians who apparently missed this lecture from their mom. It's a change in attitudes that happened. a change in ideas, a change in core convictions. In the 1880s, somewhat strangely, a noble European visitor found himself in Montana in the Powder River Valley. Now, I don't even know, I'm not even sure where that is, but anyway, the Powder River Valley. Apparently, he had just come quickly to the Powder River Valley because he wanted to, I don't know why he did this, he jumped over it, and he, over the rest of the United States, because he came up to a cowboy, and he said, apparently wanting to find a place to sleep that night, because other noblemen would help him, right? Who is your master? And the cowboy said, he ain't been born yet. Now that's the ideology, the ethics, the convictions of a free population. And that's what drove innovation. I'm fond of expressing it in English, being allowed to have a go, or as the Australians say, fair goes, equality of permission. And that liberated slaves first. That was the great first success of this idea. And eventually, slowly, drag the ball and chain and bring John. Slowly extended to women and to immigrants and to apprentices who were, but by the way, all these people I'm talking about, the immigrants, the women, the peasants, they were beaten regularly before the 19th century. It was standard. It wasn't a bad thing to beat your wife. It was a good thing. Keep her in check. And you certainly beat your apprentices. And you certainly beat your sailors and your servants in husbandry. And it's a signal, it's an emblem, it's a sign of the new equality, this particular equality, that died out. Now it's true that the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals was founded in 1825, and they waited until 1885 to found the Royal Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. This is an English peculiarity, but still. So it was freedom, it was, and the word freedom, by the way, has become ambiguous in modern English. In the last 100 years, it's come to mean the same thing as John Ball meant, or as Rumboldt meant. That's what it once meant. Now it's come to mean having capacities, having income. Amartya Sen does this. FDR did it in the famous Four Freedoms address. Number 3 is freedom from want. That's not freedom. That's the consequence of equality of permission, not the same thing as. So here we have a diagram, prosperity or flourishing and misery on this axis, coercion. Do what your husband says. Do what your master says. Do what the state says. On the other axis. Now, Jim Robinson and Joel Mokyr and I agree that at very low amounts of coercion, it's a war of all against all. But James is a Hobbesian. as he said on many occasions. And he believes that the curve of flourishing keeps going up. Here's now. Here's where we are. And he says it keeps going up. Let's have more of that. Let's have more coercion. So does his friend Achimolo. But I say, being a liberal in the correct sense, I say that, yeah, it improves, it gets to be positive here. And as Adam Smith said, though, if it goes too far, it starts going down. And my claim is very simple, and here I'll end. We don't need more government, or as Frank says, more skillful government. What's the word? More competent. We don't need more of that. We've got enough coercion. What we need is to move backwards from, I don't know, here. We're here. We need to move to a truly free society. That was the liberal idea. That's the idea that made the modern world. One more point. Why is China suddenly in the last 50 years, more prosperous than it was under Mao? Is it because of capital accumulation or exploitation of the working class? No. It's because that at least for the economy, people were reluctantly allowed to move from the center of China to the east coasts in the largest migration that's happened in human history. They were reluctantly, with a certain amount of payment to the Communist Party on the side, to start an enterprise. Their other rights, their other freedoms were ignored. But it's that little bit of liberalism that made China now have an income about the same as Brazil. And the same thing is happening in India. The little bit of, I've got to remember to use the stutter word though, not freedom, liberty, that the Indian government started to grant its citizens after 1991, that's the secret sauce. That's the spring in the mechanical watch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's always a hard act to follow Deirdre. I should have known better, but here I am. She and I will agree on some things, but you will see that this is a rather different take on a similar problem. But I'd like to start off perhaps making a distinction that is more than, that also is a difference. There's sort of three terms to describe what we're talking about here today, and they overlap heavily, but the difference between them matters, okay? There is what we call the Great Divergence, a term that was coined by your own Ken Pomeranz, by now, I need to think about it, 25 years ago, in his classic book called The Great Divergence. Then there is the Great Enrichment, for which I credit my dear friend Deirdre McCloskey. And then there is the Great Divergence. And let me sort of briefly dwell on each of those terms so that we'll know what we're talking about. The Great Divergence really describes the West, mostly England, but most of Western Europe, and China diverging at some point during and after the Industrial Revolution, timing it, roughly speaking, to the middle of the 18th century, in which living standards and economic performance in Europe and China were quite comparable until then. And then, of course, in 1750, Europe just zooms off, and these two curves sort of diverge. The Great Enrichment captures something slightly different, and that is that whatever it was that changed actually was a tide that lifted all boats, that everywhere in the world, people were beneficiaries of the innovations that occurred in the West, and so some, of course, more, some others, so inequality was preserved. But in fact, even in very poor parts of the world, life changed dramatically for the better, materially, as a result of what happens in the West. The Great Reversal is a term that we propose in a book that's now in production by myself and two co-authors, Guido Tabellini and Avner Greif. And what it really points to is a slightly different phenomenon, which is that if you go back not 250 years to the Industrial Revolution, but they say to the beginning of the millennium, the previous millennium, I should say, so the year 1000, obviously the three great Asian civilizations, the Muslim Middle East, India, and China, were way ahead of Europe in almost every dimension that you can imagine, all the way from literacy. You know, we don't have really GDP figures, but we know what living standards were, roughly speaking. We know what, you know, in terms of what they produced in terms of human culture, philosophy, poetry, you know, and so on, so science and all these things. And clearly at some point between 1000 and say 1950, if you want to pick an end date, these positions were reversed. And so these are sort of three different ways of looking at a very similar phenomenon, but they emphasize something slightly different. And so the question is what Deirdre called the secret sauce? So my secret sauce will be different from hers, as you might imagine. If I had to summarize my secret sauce in one term, it would be useful knowledge. So useful knowledge is an 18th century term, which I borrowed from basically people writing at the time. And I would argue that it really, if you're looking at what really counted in the Industrial Revolution, that's what it is. So yeah, I'm going to give you an example of why I think it sort of takes its prevalence on other things. Consider a very influential way of thinking about the Industrial Revolution, which emphasized coal. I call this the carbonocentric theory of the Industrial Revolution, because coal did play a major role, both in, of course, providing steam, but also in manufacturing, home heating, and so on and so forth. If you look at the coal curve of coal, it takes off like a rocket during the Industrial Revolution. And it sort of seems to make sense, and so Ken himself, of course, engaged in that idea, but many other people are. But here's something to keep in mind. When Julius Caesar shows up in England, the coal was there. In fact, it was exactly the same amount that was there 1,500 years later, because coal takes millions of years to be created. He didn't even notice that there was coal. The later Romans did, and they used it to heat themselves in the winter and a couple of other things, but there was no Industrial Revolution. That coal did nothing. And for good reason, because the knowledge to find it, to extract it, to get the water out of the pumps, to transport it, to utilize it, that knowledge wasn't there. When that knowledge creates it, obviously complements coal, and if the coal is there, you can use it. If there's no coal and the knowledge is there, they'll find something else, and countries that had no coal did find other solutions. So it's knowledge that is my secret sauce. All right, so that's just the preamble. Now, I want to talk briefly, much like Deirdre, about the 18th century. My high school history teacher, God bless her soul, said, the only century in which something important happened in Europe was the 18th century. Well, you know, take that or leave that. But there are two things that really are major discontinuities in the 18th century. The one was the Industrial Revolution that I already mentioned, and the other was the Enlightenment. And it would be an unbelievable coincidence if these two phenomena, which happened in Europe at roughly the same time, they were completely unconnected and unrelated to each other. This couldn't be possibly an accident. But what really is the connection? Now, the Enlightenment is a very difficult concept, and many people have struggled how to define it and sort of argued about what it really meant. And so I'm going to stick it out my neck and propose something that I think defines the Enlightenment. And you know, people will disagree with that, and probably on bad days I disagree with myself. But roughly speaking, I think the common denominator of the Enlightenment is the belief in human progress. Now, when you start looking into it, and people have, of course, is in fact progress, which I think is sort of built in our own society, is actually something that is very rare in human history. The Chinese do not really have, or didn't really have, a concept of progress. We don't see it in Islam. We don't see it in India. Even my own cultural background, which is Jewish, basically, the idea of progress is completely absent. In fact, we speak about something called Yeridat Hadorot, which means the decline of generations. Things aren't going backward, forward, they're going backward. The only thing that will rescue us, is the coming of the Messiah. But that's not progress, that's a great discontinuity, which we're still waiting for, as you may well know. Okay, and so the common denominator, as I see it, is a belief in progress. And I'll come back to that. But it is, I think, the fundamental thing. And so, coming now back to the issue of knowledge, and you'll see in a minute where I'm going. So this is a quote from somebody writing at the very eve of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is typically timed, and of course this is completely a convention by historians, but the Industrial Revolution is typically timed at around, starting at 1760. So voila, there you have a quote from 1759. So that's the time is quite good. This is from a book written by one of the great intellectuals of Britain of the 18th century, Dr. Johnson, well, his dictionary and so on. This is a different book called Rasselas. It's about some imaginary prince, and it's basically kind of in my view, sort of a silly book. But there's a conversation there between the prince and his philosopher friend Imlach, and that's worth looking at, because this is written before the Industrial Revolution. He says, by what means, he says, are the Europeans thus powerful? Or why, since they can easily visit Asia and Africa for trade and conquest, cannot the Asiatics and Africans invade their coasts, plant colonies in their ports? After all, the same winds that carried them back would bring us hither. The answer that was provided was, they are more powerful than we, sir, because they are wiser. Knowledge will always predominate over ignorance. But why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not. And so that's basically the question that I'm going to try to tackle now in these few minutes, and obviously I'm going to do a terrible job at it. Now here is one thing to think about it. If you want to relate knowledge to something like the Enlightenment, you got to slice up the Enlightenment somehow. The Enlightenment's too big a tent to really analyze in sort of a coherent way. And so people have talked about the early Enlightenment and the late Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment and the Dutch Enlightenment, maybe. And then there's the radical Enlightenment, and the moderate Enlightenment. So I'm going to add my name to it and come up with a different term, and that is the Industrial Enlightenment. And you'll see in a minute that that's actually not a completely crazy term, because after I proposed it 25 years ago, other people have sliced the Enlightenment in rather similar ways. So for instance, there you got the medical Enlightenment, you've got the agricultural Enlightenment, and there you have the artisanal Enlightenment. So clearly, slicing it up that way is not completely crazy, and I'm going to try to defend it here. But before I do, I want you to look at this diagram. So this is an engram, okay? And so it's a very crude tool, and people today do, much more sophisticated language analysis, and this will be supplemented and superseded many times. But an engram is convenient, so here it is. Look at the green curve, okay? This is the word progress, or, I use two synonyms here, improvement and betterment. And you can sort of see there's a little sort of up here in slightly after the Restoration, and then it goes down again at the beginning of the 18th century for reasons that aren't clear. But clearly, as the sort of beginning of the sort of Industrial Revolution in the middle of the 18th century, it goes up. And so people seriously start to believe in progress. What is interesting, of course, if you look at the curve for knowledge and science, it follows a very similar pattern, and so does the curve that says wealth and riches and prosperity. So I think there is a sense here, insofar that one can actually use this kind of data, there's a sense here that these things are closely these things are closely related. Now, here is the problem, okay? And here I'm going to certainly depart from the thought of my dear and beloved friend Deirdre McCloskey. The market for knowledge, if left to its own devices, stinks. Knowledge is one of those goods that in this we teach this in, I don't know, Econ, whatever, maybe Econ 1 we should teach this. This is a classic public good, okay? For one thing, it's non-rivalrous, right? So if I give you some of my knowledge, I don't have any less. It's very difficult to exclude people. It has huge numbers of externalities. It's sort of the classic case in which, markets fail. And because markets fail, as Ken Arrow pointed out, I don't know, half a century ago or more, we underproduce it. We under-incentivize knowledge, because you can invent something or you can come up with a new idea, and it's a lot of work and it takes a lot of ingenuity, and then when you're done, what do you have? And so incentivizing invention is a major issue. And this is one of the things that the Industrial Enlightenment struggle with. So here are two quotes from two well-known, shall we say, Enlightenment thinkers. The first one is by Goethe, and better representative of the Enlightenment in Germany is hard to find. And Goethe was a man of course, many skills, and he points this out. He says, look, what you really want to do is have what we call today intellectual property rights. He doesn't use that term, of course, but that's what it really is. And he says, the clever Englishman, he says, England has had a patent system since 1624, transforms it by a patent into a possession. And then he adds the following line, and that's important. One may well ask why they are in every respect ahead of us. So here is Deirdre's deity, Adam Smith. I will not make a cross, I'm Jewish, I'm sorry. But basically what Adam Smith adds to this is a very important component. He says, why a patent is a good idea is because of the market test. Look at the last line. He says, the reward is going to be proportional to the merit of the invention. So if the invention be good and profitable to mankind, he will probably make a fortune. If it be no good, it will be no benefit. That is an important insight. We need to incentivize inventions, but incentivize them in a clever way. And that, I think, is a core idea of the Industrial Enlightenment. We want progress. How are we going to get progress? By inventions, by new devices. But in order to get them, we need to have a system that incentivizes them. And I think that is really become an inseparable part of the Industrial Enlightenment. And it's not surprising, perhaps, that the two great revolutions inspired by the Enlightenment, the American Revolution and the French Revolution, within 2 years of the overthrow of the Ancien regime, they passed patent laws, because it became quite widely accepted that a patent system is critical to progress. That, I think, is one of the great insights of the Industrial Enlightenment. Now, if the intellectual property rights and the patent system actually drove the British Industrial Revolution is much more doubtful. We now know that less than 1 in 6 of major inventions actually was ever patented, and that the patent system failed many, many people. And so, I think the latest consensus is a book by a guy called Sean Bottomley, who basically comes up with I think, a moderate conclusion is, yes, on the whole, it had a positive effect, but underneath the text it says probably, it wasn't particularly big. Some people at the time obviously did not like it for a whole variety of reasons. So here's a quote I couldn't quite. This is from Charles Babbage about the British patent system. He says, "It's a fraudulent lottery which gives its blanks to genius and its prizes to knaves." I mean, he's clearly a cantankerous guy, but you see what I'm getting at. Now, the age realized that patents weren't going to be enough, and so there's a whole slew of other rewards that they did to encourage innovation. And we all know what they are, because as academics, these are still the things that incentivize us. Membership in prestigious societies, okay? There's nothing better for a British inventor, to be elected into the Royal Society. A few were. Then there are smaller societies. There's the Smithsonian Society for engineers. There are medals, The Copley Medal is established in the middle of the 18th century for people making major contributions. Then there's the Rumford Medal by Count Rumford. The first winner of it was Count Rumford, That's how these things were. And then there are all kinds of other organizations inspired by the Industrial Enlightenment, like the famous Society of Arts, which is established in the middle of the 1750s, and which actually gives out medals and small prizes. Interestingly enough, in order to win one of those prizes, you could not patent it. In some cases, if the invention was sufficiently meritorious, then Parliament would actually recognize it and give you some kind of a pension or some kind of a payment. The biggest of all went to Edward Jenner, who of course did not patent the vaccination against smallpox. And one day he was voted, I think, an altogether £30,000 pension, which was a huge sum. And of course, once that happens, the incentive effect is clear. Everybody sees that and says, well, maybe there is some pot of gold at the end of this rainbow. So the Industrial Enlightenment, in part, is about incentivizing invention. And it did so, I think, reasonably well. But, and here's the big but, of course, knowledge is useless in the economy unless people have access to it. That, I think, is quite clear. And so the other side of what I call the Industrial Enlightenment is making access cheaper, easier, faster, more efficient, so that knowledge could spread, diffuse, and disseminate. And much of what we see happening in the 18th century should be seen as part of that phenomenon. So one of the great insights of the Industrial Enlightenment is that people who make things and people who know things should talk to each other. Now, you start looking at the details and you say, well, but the people who knew things, most of the things that they knew were wrong. And so they couldn't have helped all that much. But of course, if they talked to the people who make things and they are seeing what the problems are, the research may be going in some way that will help them. And we do know from little scraps of evidence that the leaders of the Industrial Revolution believed that they could learn from what was at the time best practice science. So there's a famous correspondence between James Watt and his two Scottish mentors, Joseph Black and John Robinson, in Edinburgh, in which he asking them all kind of questions about physics. Now, this is physics in the 1770s, 1780s, so it's not quite, Einstein, but, some of these things they could answer. There's a famous letter by the great potter, Josiah Wedgwood, who embodied many of the Enlightenment sort of principles, in which he has some problem with some lacquer he wants to put on some pots. I forget the exact details. But who does he write to? He writes to Antoine Lavoisier, the greatest chemist alive. And at that time, he says, how do I do this? Unfortunately, we don't have Lavoisier's response. He may never have responded. But there's a notion there that people who make things should talk to people who know things and vice versa. So here's where they were meeting. On the left, you see this is a very famous picture. This, of course, is the Lunar Society of Birmingham, in which a whole bunch of scientists and manufacturers met. So Josiah Wedgwood was there, and Matthew Boulton, James Watt, but also scientists. For instance, Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, was a charter member. And these people met once a month, which is why they were the Lunar Society, and they talked about machines, and they talked about inventions, and they talked about how science could be applied to. On the right, this is the London Chapter Coffee House. This is the book. I couldn't find any good illustration of it. But this is a place where in London where people would meet and talk, and that's what the title of the book says, Chemistry and Steam. But they talked about more. They talked about mining. They talked about physics. They talked about mathematics. This is where, the savants and the fabricants, the people who knew things and the people who made things, were meeting and discussing things. And I think that's how knowledge spreads, and that's how it became accessible. But there's more. And this is something that I think it isn't quite fully recognized, and I would really like to imprint it on you. Most technical knowledge, say before the middle of the 18th century, is what we call tacit knowledge. Using this famous distinction between that made was the phenomenologist, epistemologist Michael Polanyi. So tacit knowledge is basically what it sounds like. It's knowledge that is, that I know how to make something, but I can't tell you how. I can't describe it. I don't know why. But this is how you make steel, this is how you make shoes, this is how you bake bread, and so on and so forth. And tacit knowledge is passed on basically through personal contact, which is basically, you want to learn how to make bread, look at how I'm doing it and do the same. Okay, that's basically how knowledge is passed on. Now, that kind of knowledge is rather inaccessible to anybody who's not personally there. And so what the Industrial Enlightenment realized is what is important is to codify, to write and describe and picture technology so that others can have access to it. And in fact, many of the most famous documents that we associate with the Enlightenment have exactly that character. So here's the most famous of all these pictures. This, of course, is from Diderot and d'Alembert's Grande Encyclopédie, and of which there are thousands of technical descriptions and pictures, of which this is the most famous one. This is épinglier, this is pin making, and according to an unsubstantiated account, this is what inspired Adam Smith to write the first chapter of his Wealth of Nations, describing the division of labor. But what you have to understand is that this kind of picture, with this kind of detail, is reproduced hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times in the encyclopedia. And what we know today is, modern researchers have looked at this, they've shown that the dissemination of the encyclopedia is actually correlated with economic development and industrialization. This is a famous paper by Voigtlander and Squicciarini in the QJE, by now about 10 years old. And so the Grande Encyclopédie is the most famous document, but by no means the only one. And so here's one that's less well known, but I'm very fond of. This is the Description des Arts et Métiers. And this was a huge work, 82 volumes, ladies and gentlemen. I read in my younger days about 10 of them, boring as hell, trust me on that. But for each industry, for each craft, for each art, there's a separate volume that describes it in meticulous detail. And basically, these things could be found in libraries. They could be found in the houses of rich noblemen who bought the whole stuff, not because they read it themselves, but because they wanted to have others to have access to it. So here's just one example, just for the heck of it. This is the Art du Serrurier. This is locksmith making. So look at the technical detail. Now, if you knew nothing about locksmith and you had this book, you still wouldn't be a locksmith. Of course not. You couldn't just learn from it. But if you were a locksmith or you were an apprentice locksmith and you wanted to see best practice locksmith making, this is the first place you'd go to. Now, of course, over time, these big things became obsolete. What is interesting, by the way, that these, for some reason, the French were the ones that did this much more so than the English. So one historian said, well, the English were inventing and the French were writing about it. That's not quite fair, but there's something to it. Now, England isn't completely useless, so here is a similar thing from England. This is the complete dictionary of arts and sciences and human learning. Everything you wanted to know about human learning that came out in 1764. And so you can sort of see all the things that are being described in this is a huge book. And it's not for beginners, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, the things in physics, have fairly advanced differential equations in them. This is serious stuff. And look what he's discussing. Okay, so some things are useful, like anatomy and pharmacy. And then, of course, there's things like surgery, but also hydraulics, mechanics, pneumatics, and on and on and on. And this book was sold, I think, in 1,500 copies. So most people in England, if they wanted, had access to it. And what I think this does, this captures the other side of the Industrial Enlightenment, which is you incentivize the creation of new knowledge, and then you do everything you can to make sure people have access to it so that they can use it. And I think this is sort of the secret, because otherwise, how would the creation of useful knowledge ever affect the economy? So just to sum up, I think this philosopher that Prince Rasselas was talking to was right. Certainly by the 18th century, people in Western Europe, not just in England, but all over the sort of Western part, were increasing their set of useful knowledge at a very rapid rate. Now, this is not a straight line, and there are lots of sort of setbacks and lots of resistance, and every once in a while they discover something that ain't so. But by and large, this is the kind of thing that advances because, as we have always known, knowledge, certainly at that age, is cumulative. So that is the definition of progress. Applying it to the economy, whether you're making steel, or whether you're using fertilizer in agriculture, or whether you're vaccinating people against smallpox, or whether you're teaching them how to navigate and find longitude at sea. Each of those examples of progress contributes in some way to human welfare. And because knowledge is the only form of economic growth that does not run into diminishing returns, or what I call the curse of concavity. So most forms of economic growth, like capital accumulation and realizing the gains from trade and better allocation of resources, they're great and they help people get prosperous, but each of them has some kind of upper limit, and then you run into diminishing returns. With the accumulation of useful knowledge, there seems to be, and I emphasize, there seems to be no upper bound. Now, my colleague Robert Gordon thinks differently, and other people probably do. Maybe there is some limit on what we people can know, but history is full of examples of people say, well, everything useful can be invented, and then somebody comes up with something radical. Having said that, and now I'm coming back to kind of some of the things that Deirdre was talking about. Of course, knowledge is a necessary, but never a sufficient condition. The knowledge has to be generated in a world in which the environment is friendly to it, in which innovators are respected and not chased out because they're engaging in black magic or wizardry of some kind of that. You need to be able to overcome resistance to new knowledge, because in every society at all times there are people who don't like innovation for one reason or another, because it threatens their livelihood, or because it offends the deity, or because of the possible disasters that could happen, whatever. You need to be able to have a government that overcomes that. And even so, the government in Britain had many flaws. One of the things that they would not tolerate is resistance to new knowledge. And so when the Luddite riots break out in the Midlands in 1812, it's a complicated story, I don't want to get into it, but it's worth pointing out that the British government, at that time, had more soldiers in the Midlands protecting factories than they have had soldiers in Spain fighting against Napoleon. That was clearly a priority, which is innovation is good, some people don't like it, They can try to avoid it, but if they try violence, we will stop them. And finally, I think, what of course mattered, and this I learned from Douglas North and many other people, is that you need a world in which if you have people who bring together science and knowledge and business, and you can call them entrepreneurs, you can call them what you want, but they're in it for the money. And one condition that is critical is that if they make the money, they're going to be able to keep it. And in fact, that is what happens in Britain during the Industrial Revolution, and everybody knew it. So a man like Richard Arkwright, okay, the great innovator in cotton spinning, he died a country gentleman in a beautiful rural estate in England from money that he had made spinning cotton. And the same is true for a number of other people that we know, the Peels and the Watts and so on and so forth. These people were allowed to keep their money because this was a society in which property rights were respected. And extending those property rights to knowledge is to a very important component of my secret sauce. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So in the spirit of Changtai and I didn't collude on this one, but in the spirit of self-subversion and the Chicago spirit of self-subversion, and also in the spirit of, trying to think about the relationship between culture and economic progress in a sort of broader way, because I don't really consider myself an expert on the Industrial Revolution in the way that Professor McCloskey or Professor Mokyr is. My work for the past my work for the past 32 years has been, in the global South, and that's what I know more about. So I'd like to talk about the relationship between culture and sort of economic growth more broadly, and I'm going to do it in a way that focuses on things that I feel like I don't understand, and perhaps I'm going to claim that we don't understand too well. Okay, and I'm going to use a sort of motivating example, which I think a lot about, and I've been thinking a lot about for quite a while, which is the Chinese puzzle. Here's a great article I came across in the media last week. This is Chinese baristas stirring up Italy's purist coffee culture. So Chinese people buying up Italian coffee shops and ruffling the neighborhoods. And I thought, this is kind of amazing. It's sort of indicative of the scope and enormity of, what's been happening in China in the last 50 years. And I guess I'm going to start by saying, I think there's a lot of puzzles associated with this, and we don't really understand what's been going on in China in a deep way, or at least I don't. I'm happy if other people say they do and they can explain it to me. There's different types of explanation for what's happened in China. A lot of economists have focused on the reforms and the success of the reforms and the way the reforms happened. There's a brilliant book by Yingyi Qian about that. But that tends to neglect the politics of the process behind it. I think many scholars, when they start looking at the politics of the process, sort of say, well, we know what the politics has to look like for this to work. And so if we look hard enough, we'll find it. What does the politics of the process have to look like? Well, the government seems to be acting in the collective interest somehow, and governments only do that if they're accountable somewhere or to somebody, and we can't really see how on earth that could work in China, but if we look hard enough, we'll find it, okay? So that doesn't seem very plausible to me. There's another argument that, well, of course, China was a very poor country in the 1970s with technology that was very far from the world technology frontier, and you don't really need proper institutions to grow very rapidly when you're far from the world technology frontier. And, relatedly, you could say, and this is an argument that, we made in Why Nations Fail, there's many instances of what we call extractive growth in world history. You think of the Soviet Union between, the mid-1920s and the mid-1970s. That was so successful that economic historians wrote books about how it was a model for a development strategy. Argentina up until the First World War, okay? But I'd like to start out by saying I'm not sure we have the right sort of explanation of what's gone on in China and how it all fits together, okay? And here's an alternative hypothesis. I think if you read, political thought or political theory, Western thought is dominated by a kind of intellectual tradition that you could trace all the way back to Aristotle's Politics. Actually, it's much older than that. It's embedded in the Spartan constitution, for example, which is which is a long time before that. And there's this notion, there's a kind of notion of what the political problems are in society and how to solve them by designing institutions and aligning incentives. Okay, so that tradition in Aristotle's Politics runs right the way through Western thought, for hundreds of years, okay? But other parts of the world have very different intellectual traditions. The Middle East or the Muslim intellectual tradition, the Islamic political tradition is extremely different. The Chinese political tradition is extremely different. And the idea traditionally in Chinese thought of how you achieve good governance is dramatically different from Aristotle's ideas. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, here's an example from one of the great Confucian classics, The Great Learning. Okay, so here's how to achieve good governance. Their thoughts being sincere, their hearts were then rectified. So you start with individuals rectifying themselves. Their hearts being rectified, their persons were cultivated. Their persons being cultivated, their families were regulated. So in a famous image, things start rippling out from the individual into society to the family. Their families being regulated, their states were rightly governed. Their states being rightly governed, the whole kingdom was made tranquil and happy. Okay, so you can tell me, I'm happy if you tell me this is irrelevant to thinking about China. But it's fascinating to me that the historical model of how good governance is achieved in China looks absolutely nothing like this Western Aristotelian tradition, okay? So here, good governance starts with individual self-improvement and ripples up to the level of the state, okay? So that's a hypothesis. It's very hard in my view, to think about what's happened in China through the lens of this Aristotelian tradition. So here's an alternative hypothesis I'm advancing, an alternative hypothesis. Now, that's a completely different cultural model of growth, you could say. And I think if that was right, it would be extremely unlikely that China was the only part of the world that had a kind of non-Western model of economic growth, okay? You can think of potential mechanisms in the Chinese case. Anyone who's taught Chinese students knows about this obsession with meritocracy in Chinese society. That's a mechanism. Confucius talked about that. But, I'm gonna just advance for the sake of argument the rippling up from the bottom mechanism. Okay, so the idea here is that that's a completely different model of governance that might allow a market economy to flourish. Okay, now you might say, okay, but hold on a second. Confucius was writing this 2,500 years ago. Chinese growth took off in 1978. Well, there were moments, as Professor Mokyr was talking about earlier in history, but we sort of have an explanation in economic history about the timing here. There's a famous literature starting with our colleague here in the history department, Kenneth Pomerantz, Bin Wong at UCLA, sort of popularized by Ian Morris, that basically argues that, the Chinese society was always consistent with economic growth. It's just that they were unlucky, and at just the time when modern economic growth appeared, there was a big sort of mess going on. Maybe there were Malthusian dynamics. I'm not a big fan of Malthusianism, so I'm going to emphasize, corruption, endemic high-level corruption in the Qing state. And then there's just bad luck, basically, and a whole series of path-dependent messes. And when the Chinese finally kind of extract themselves from all that noise, then the juggernaut gets going. Okay, so there's an explanation for the timing which comes from this historical literature. Okay, I think, you know, this hypothesis I advanced is very hard to think about from a social science perspective. Okay, this idea of the great learning. Okay, it's very hard to think about it, like, just because that's just not how we think about things in Western economics or Western political economy or political science. That kind of mechanism is sort of really hard to get your head around, okay? So I think actually for me personally, the deeper issue is, you know, we have all this social theory, not just economics, but political, you know, science, which is my own discipline, you could say. And we have a theory of the way we think about the world, the way we think about the economy, and the way we think about politics and the political system and the structuring of political legitimacy and authority is very calibrated on that Western kind of Aristotelian tradition. You know, I don't want to say anything bad about the great Adam Smith, you know, but I just would like to point out that Adam Smith, you know, looked out of his window in Kirkcaldy in Scotland, which is where he sort of wrote The Wealth of Nations, and he looked at the society, observed the society where he grew up, and he came up with some abstractions, okay? But if he'd been sitting in Nigeria, which I know more about than Scotland, he'd have seen a very different type of society, okay? So he'd have seen very different economic institutions, very different political institutions, and if The Wealth of Nations had been written in Tivland, he might not have called it The Wealth of Nations, actually. He would have made an extremely different argument about the economy, okay? Of course, Adam Smith was making both positive claims and kind of normative claims, meaning this is what goes on, but it would be better if this other thing went on instead, okay? But my point is that the generalizations are very context specific, okay? You know, in Eastern Nigeria, you know, why am I talking about Tivland in Eastern Nigeria? Because the traditional economic institutions were very well studied in this part of Nigeria by anthropologists in the 1940s and 1950s, so we sort of know a lot about it. I won't get into the details, but I just want to say the organization of the economy and the political system would have looked very different. So what kind of generalizations would you make? And who had the right theory? Did Adam Smith have the right theory? Well, he had a generalization from his context. It was a pretty good generalization. But who had the better theory? Well, I think that depends on what you're trying to achieve. You could say, well, I could have abstracted a theory of the economy in Eastern Nigeria, and that would have just been a terrible theory, you know. Maybe. But I think what I would say, and I think what all the historical evidence suggests, is that the difference between those societies is that people were trying to achieve something different in Eastern Nigeria than they were trying to achieve in Scotland. It could be, I mean, this is arguable, in Scotland they were trying to achieve an efficient allocation of resources and the division of labor and technological change. They weren't trying to achieve that in Nigeria. It was a rational society, but it was organized along with very different objectives. You know, so here's a quote from Paul and Laura Bohannon, the kind of anthropologists who studied it. Paul Bohannon, who was a former colleague of Joel's at Northwestern in the anthropology department. To the Tiv, a market is not merely a place to buy and sell. It's a political institution of major importance because in a society that's dominated by the lineage principle, it's a means of overriding that principle, okay? Now, economists would look at that and say, well, this was an underdeveloped country, you know, with lousy institutions, you know, we need to come and develop it. That's kind of what colonial officials thought too. By the way, my father was a colonial official in Nigeria, and that's what he thought. He thought he was bringing modernity and progress and technology to the benighted Nigerians, you know. But I actually think all the evidence suggests that the Nigerian society was actually organized in a perfectly rational way. They had an order, it was legitimate, it was trying to achieve something different from the way society in Kirkcaldy was organized. I think there were lots of trade-offs there. I think it's right, as you know, as Professor McCloskey and Professor Mokyr have been discussing, that you know the way Nigerian society got organized did not create the Industrial Revolution. It did not, lead to the invention of the separate condenser. It did not have the same consequences of technological dynamism that the society which emerged in Scotland did. And there were lots of trade-offs. Okay, so I don't want to go into this in detail. A lot of my research in Africa in the last 20 years has sort of illustrated many of those trade-offs between kind of the way society got organized and is still organized in many ways in large parts of Africa, and economic, what you might call economic progress. Okay, but I think what I just want to say here is that, the economic theory of the TIV people, sure, it was emphasized, to use a word that Polanyi used in the 1940s, it was embedded in society in a kind of profound way, and it had consequences for the economy, but it also had beneficial effects that people valued, okay? It had a lot of path-dependent consequences also. This is the Battle of Omdurman, where the Maxim gun was first used to massacre Africans by the British forces under General Kitchener. Okay, so what do you do with all of this? So what I'd like to do is think of a kind of way of organizing these comments using a very famous article by Alexander Gerschenkron. This is an essay that I loved when I was a PhD student, when I took economic history at Yale, as Professor Mokyr did. Economic backwardness in historical perspective. You probably read this when you were a graduate student too. Okay, so let me remind you of Gerschenkron's thesis. Gerschenkron's thesis was there's really no one way to kind of grow economically. The British did their thing, and we've been talking about the British thing. But other people did different things. Maybe that was because they couldn't do what the British did. Germany started industrializing later. They needed to accumulate a lot of capital. The British did it slowly, slowly, slowly. But the Germans created a substitute, which was these banks. Okay? What about the Russians? Then Gerschenkron looks at Russian industrialization, the Tsarist industrialization. Well, they didn't have banks in Russia, and they were even more, backward, to use his terminology. What did they do? The state took the lead in industrializing. Okay. So I want to I always liked that article a lot because it sort of has this idea of there's different paths to economic development. There's different ways you can do it. But I guess what I want to say is we need to enormously augment that way of thinking, of Gerschenkron's way of thinking. And I want to propose an augmented theory which I'm going to have 3 categories. First, alternatives, second, I'm going to call it substitutes. That's very much what Gerschenkron was thinking about. And third, and kind of most radically, I'm going to talk about advantages, okay? What do I mean by these? Well, alternatives I've already kind of talked about. I think, like, the way I look at African history is Africans were not trying to, we don't want to think of African society as trying to achieve what we did, but we succeeded and they failed. I think that's a very misleading way of thinking about Africa historically. Africa's talking about Africa is, I should apologize by talking about Africa. Africa's so diverse, but I could talk about that a lot, but if I do, we'll never finish. So just let me flag that and come back to say, I think there's a lot of many cases where they're trying to achieve something different, okay? So I think we should recognize that and recognize that as a possibility in other parts of the world. What about substitutes? Maybe my argument about, the great learning or the Confucian model of growth, which I advanced as a sort of outrageous hypothesis, fits in here. Of course, Gerschenkron was just thinking about kind of economics. He wasn't really thinking about the political circumstances that allow economic growth to take place, which is what a lot of my work has been about. And the Confucian model, was suggested in that spirit. Here's a different way of thinking about what political circumstances allow economic growth to take place. But I think there's many other ways, if I look at the developing world, there's many other ways, many other cultural compatibilities between, political equilibria and economic growth. I give you 2. I'm a little anxious. I don't have much time left. How long do I have? 13 minutes. How long? 13. Oh, brilliant. Okay. Okay. just let me give you a couple of examples, and I'll give you a couple of examples of advantages, what I mean by advantages, okay? So what I mean by substitutes is we need to think much more broadly, it seems to me, about what type of cultures are consistent with outside this kind of Aristotelian, Smithian tradition. What other kind of cultures are consistent with sustained economic growth? I think it's worth thinking through this issue of there could be a very big difference between what it takes to be the kind of first industrial nation, between, what you could call pristine economic growth and secondary economic growth. Once the English did it, then that creates all sorts of possibilities that might not have existed before the English did it. But with that in mind, just let me talk about two examples that I know something about, at least know more about than Scotland. And one is, work that Leander Heldring and I have been doing on Rwandan economic growth in the last 30 years. So I'm just going to sketch this. What Rwanda have is what they call homegrown initiatives. And the homegrown initiatives are incredibly culturally rooted. They use the traditional mechanisms in their society to implement policy and to kind of provide public goods. Now, Rwanda has grown very rapidly for 30 years. You're going to say, okay, but they're just doing easy stuff. They're building roads and schools and, doing export agriculture. Sure, but in 1970, what were Korea's biggest exports? Plywood, apparel, and wigs made of human hair. That was about 10% of exports. That didn't look too sexy in 1970, Korea. So don't give the Rwandans too hard a time that they're not, exporting, microchip processors. Okay. So what do we know about? This will make Professor McCloskey happy. This picture. Okay. So what do we know about, what's supposed to drive economic growth? Well, you need to have state capacity, Professor Fukuyama would say. Here's the organization of the Rwandan state at the low level, okay, going right down to the Nyumbakumi. Okay, that's a group of like 10 households. Okay, so this is a map of the people who run the Rwandan state. And I just want to point out one thing about them without getting into the details. Hardly anyone gets paid, okay? So here's the next level up, the village, then the cell, then the sector. You can see at the level of the village, nobody gets paid. At the level of the cell, there's one person who gets paid, the secretary executive. Most people running the state don't get paid. Even when I go up to the sector, there's people with a salary, but you still get people who don't have a salary, okay? How come all these people are running the state without a pay? What's their problem? Well, because they're incentivized by the traditional mechanisms of reciprocity and the way that Rwandan society hangs together, okay? Here's a picture of President Kagame, giving out prizes for service delivery. Imihigo is the name of the biggest homegrown initiative in Rwanda. It's based on a pre-colonial practice of reciprocity and kind of honor in some sense. Okay, so the way this works, we were in Rwanda in the summer studying this, is, villages and the state kind of interact in this vast system of, we ask for this, what will you give us? If you give us that, we'll do this. Unpaid state, unpaid labor, people contributing to make the whole thing work. Okay, so this is deeply culturally rooted, but it's not like any growth model you've ever seen or thought about. Reading The Wealth of Nations, and that's fine, because The Wealth of Nations wasn't about Rwanda. It was about Scotland and maybe the Western world, and that's fine. My point is, the whole world isn't like that. Okay. Now you might say, I'm going to say, here's President Kagame in the middle of this picture. President Kagame, if you Google him, you'll find people accusing him of being a dictator. Okay. I'm not going to comment on that. But what I am going to tell you is about Botswana. Okay. Here's Botswana. Now, Botswana has been run by the same political party since 1966. Okay? It's basically a one-party state. The Botswana Democratic Party never looks like losing. It's not counted as a democracy by political scientists who collect data on things like this. So where is the governance in Botswana? It's not in the national elections. We're all on tenterhooks about what's going to happen in a couple of weeks. No one's on tenterhooks in Botswana when there's an election, okay? So where is the governance? Here's the governance. This is what's called the Hotla. This is a village, this is a photograph I took from a book by Olof Gulbrandsen, who's a Norwegian anthropologist at the University of Bergen. And here's a civil servant here in his nice Western suit, standing up in front of the people in the Hotla. So what's the Hotla? The Hotla is a traditional assembly where people come to deliberate and discuss policy, to forge consensus. Nobody votes about anything, okay? But this is where people are accountable and people explain what's going on. So where the good governance comes from is not elections or voting or whatever. It comes from traditional mechanisms of deliberation and consensus. That's the way people make decisions in Africa, okay? So there is good governance, and there is a kind of political culture which has driven economic growth in Botswana. It's one of the most successful countries in the world over the past 50 years. It's been overtaken by China, but when I started studying Botswana 25 years ago, it was actually the fastest growing country in the world in the previous 30 years, and it took me some time to figure out how that fitted together, okay? So that's, that's just a plea for thinking about how things work in the non-Western world and what kind of cultures are consistent with public good provision and economic growth. And I think, you're going to think this is even more outrageous, is that maybe we actually have something to learn from these other societies. A couple of years ago, I was asked by the World Bank to come to an Africa Knowledge Fest. So, this was in DC. I show up, I had my slides and, everything. And I thought this was going to be people talking about Africa and Africans talking about. No, it was World Bank functionaries talking about how great the World Bank is and how we've saved Africa and done all these great things and look at the photograph of this road and stuff like that. So I threw away my notes and I said, look, seriously, I don't know that any African ever learned anything from me. I'm just going to tell you about what I learned from Africans because I thought that's what we were going to be discussing, okay? So in the spirit of those remarks, I haven't been invited back since then. In the spirit of those remarks, let me just say a couple of things, okay, about Africa. One, we're in this world of inequality, enormous enhanced inequality, where the majority of people in the United States are no better off than they were 50 years ago. And, maybe I'm missing something here, but that seems to be causing a few problems in the political space, okay? And one of the things it seems to me is, in American society, we really have problems dealing with this. We have problems dealing with this corrosive inequality. As far as I can tell, nobody's actually discussing a serious policy which will do anything to dent levels of inequality in this election, okay? And why is that? Well, because we have this particular view of inequality. We have this view, highly kind of individualistic view. Let's go back to John Locke, private property, it's mine, it's not the state like Hobbes. Private property is defined. No, it comes from individual labor and initiative, okay? But, I'm just quoting here from James Ferguson, who's an anthropologist at Stanford University. He has this very interesting book called Give a Man a Fish. I won't go into what the general thesis of the book is, but one of the chapters is he's sort of discussing how, well, African society is much more collectivist than Western society. And you could say, well, that's bad for incentives and innovation and economic growth. Maybe, there's trade-offs, I said, there's trade-offs. But one thing African society is very redistributed. And it's redistributive in a particular way with a particular idea about rights, okay? When we talk about redistribution of income, we think, oh, that's a gross violation of property rights, or it's like altruism. Bill Gates, he's so altruistic, it's sort of giving, etc., okay? What Ferguson points out is that in Africa, the ideas about rights are completely different. Nobody's giving anything to anybody. If you're economically successful, other people have a right to your success. They have a right to your income, okay? The proper and just division of a whole to which all have a claim. No one is giving anyone to anything, okay? So there's a claim, made by some philosophers, I'm not maybe competent enough to evaluate it, that one of the problems with liberalism is that there's an inconsistency between the emphasis on individualism and individual property and kind of combining that with democracy because of the enormous amount of inequality that the system generates, okay? So I don't want to comment on that, but I do want to comment on the fact that in Africa, there's a very different cultural idea of what redistribution is about and the system of rights underpinning it. And let me finish with my last example, which I always like, which is what I call African cosmopolitanism. Okay, so, one of the things that I find so exciting about working in Africa is Africans are the most cosmopolitan people in the world. I don't know an African who doesn't speak 6 languages. They're so used to dealing with diversity, different histories, different languages, different cultures, different people. Okay, and here's my favorite index of this, which is some work that Soren Hen and I have been doing, which is looking at languages across the world for which we could collect data on the words for guest and stranger, okay? So in many, many, many African languages, not Afrikaans, that's Afrikaans down there in the bottom, not Afrikaans, you'll be surprised to hear. Many, many African languages, the words for guest and stranger is the same, okay? There's an incredible tradition of hospitality, which is connected to a history of movement and migration and incorporation and but I always think, in this world today so polarized and divided, the idea that guest and stranger is a kind of equivalent concepts is a beautiful idea. All right, so my last slide and I'll shut up, okay? I think you got the idea. I think we're talking about culture, we're talking about the cultural roots of modern economic growth. I don't think I really disagree with a lot of what has been said. I think I just want to kind of broaden the discussion and say, I use the Chinese case not because I'm an expert on China, but of course because China has achieved so much in the last 50 years. If I started by talking about Rwanda, you'd be like, where? Like some country in East Africa? But you can't ignore China, Maybe you have a theory, maybe Chiang Tai has a theory that explains it, but I don't understand it. And so I wanted to just use that as a vehicle for sort of throwing open the conversation about culture and economic progress more generally. Okay, thank you.
My name is Jim Heckman. I'm helping to run this program, and we organize this together with BFI and the other organizations. And what we're going to do now is try to encourage a discussion among the 3 speakers. They obviously have somewhat different perspectives, in fact, quite different perspectives on some things. And so we want to allow there to be an interchange among those. And I guess I'll police it, if you don't mind. So I'll try to tell you just when to shut up or let somebody else respond. But I want to make a few comments of my own just to kind of get it going. And I felt that there were these 3 talks, all very interesting. But I had a sense that maybe the convergence of these 3, was somewhat, well, let's just say I didn't see a convergence point of view here. And I felt in some sense that nobody doubted the fact that ideas, fundamentally new knowledge, fire, printing press, whatever, the wheel, all of these great technological inventions have created human progress. I don't think anybody doubts that whatsoever. I think the issue is so I also would be willing to go one step further than anybody did today and say that there's a basic instinct of curiosity. Do you remember this, where there's a famous University of Chicago economist / sociologist, Thorstein Veblen, right? And he talked about the instincts that human beings had, and one was the instinct of curiosity. A second, by the way, in terms of Joel's talk, was the instinct of workmanship, pride in what you were doing. And so there was a sense that I think we all agree that people are basically very, very curious, and people are always wondering. I mean, Benjamin Franklin is probably one of the most famous curious people with all of his explanations, but I would say everybody in different environments is curious, so I don't think anybody's quarreling with that. I think, though, that there was a statement made by the first 2 speakers that somehow didn't get in my mind. I mean, liberty was what Deirdre was talking about as what I saw as a facilitating principle which allowed curiosity to be expressed. But missing in my analysis and what I heard, and maybe you're going to develop it, was some of the institutions that actually promote that. In other words, what is it that allows curiosity? Is there liberty? If we had liberty where gangs were murdering each other, you're the Isaiah Berlin. You have negative and positive liberty, right? So you might want to think sincerely about different types of liberty, but also the kind of freedom that really does produce some ideas, something tangible out of this. Let me just finish. I'll just throw these ideas out. So I'd like to see that. I think that was discussed, and Joel had a very clear sense of an institution that arose from that. And I think from the idea of liberty that created a possibility of exchange, and that was in some sense, although he didn't really put it in this way, maybe he would, that there was some of the innovations that occurred were more than just innovations in machines. There were also innovations in institutions, like designing the Constitution of the United States, designing the way that states would form. There were a lot of experiments that were being done, and that was also part of this whole process. But so the question is, how do these ideas, whether political or economic or social, manifest themselves, and what is it that facilitates that? So I hope we can get to some convergence, or at least some thinking. And then, in terms of the last talk, you were really talking a lot about anthropology. And the one person that came to my mind, there's a very famous anthropologist here at the University of Chicago named Saul Tax, who wrote this book called Penny Capitalism. It was a very powerful book, but it also really created, and I really do believe, and I think more than James Robinson was willing to say, that it's not like there are different impulses. I think the propensity to bargain, to truck, to kind of gain advantage is pretty universal. I would put that on the same play as same ground as I would with curiosity. It's an instinct, and books have been written about this, and I think I'd be curious to see that that's something that's very there. And then this notion that you had of sort of the African culture of going from the individual up to the state. And the contrasting that with Aristotle, I found a little jarring, because if you read Aristotle, there's an awful lot of discussion about virtue and about self-control, exactly these kinds of aspects that make a good society, and the fact that these societies are based on that. So that I didn't see the contrast that you saw between Aristotle and the Chinese contrast, in the sense that really, if you read Politics of Aristotle, you read a lot of the books of Aristotle, this question. So those are all very broad and general questions, and I hope that we will, and then the audience will be brought into this discussion, so be patient. But we want to hear from you, because it'll be very important, I think, very smart group of people, curious, instincts and so forth. But I think the speakers should probably try to at least respond in some way. So well, Deirdre's ready to go.
I'll respond, Jim. I think the idea of the idea is Jesus, Mary and Joseph, is liberty. That when applied makes all the difference. And I think the way Jim was talking about the sort of, if you'll accept the comparison, the New England town meeting character of these African systems of governance. Again, it depends on liberty. It depends on people being able to speak. There's a marvelous poster of the first of FDR's four freedoms, that is freedom of speech, by Norman Rockwell, where a man is standing up to speak in something like a New England town meeting, and he's a working man. You can tell from his clothes, and everyone around him is not, and yet he's permitted to speak. This was an odd characteristic of Athenian and certain other of the Greek democracies. But in fact, I think it's very widespread in human culture, this allowing ordinary people to speak. On the Enlightenment, I want to force Joel to admit that Catherine the Great was enlightened. Frederick the Great was enlightened. He composed music that is still played. Enlightenment as a kind of hobby of tyrants was commonplace in the 18th century. So I'm sort of irritated by mixing. Here's what I'm saying. Here's my claim. Liberalism is not the same thing as enlightenment. You can be enlightened and not care for equality of permission at all. So it's not just the ideas for steam engines that matter. It's ideas of human respect for each other, which I think is crucial, and that does change. I think that's why China and India have grown. That's just thought.
All right, well,
You got a microphone?
I have a microphone. I need this.
She's mic'd.
I'm not going to, defend Enlightenment here. I mean, I have my library at home overflowing with books on the Enlightenment, and they all contradict each other, and
I'm in favor.
they fight each other. But so this is not, as I said, it's a very large tent that include. But there are common denominators, and even I think the two examples that you picked, who neither of them would be, jump to my mind as the first names that come up when you talk about the Enlightenment. But these people too, in their own way, had a belief in progress. Let's leave it at that. Progress for Russia, progress for Prussia. Yep. I mean, these things did happen. But I want to talk about something else, which I think hasn't come up yet, and that is, Jim Heckman talked about the idea of ideas. And, something that I learned early on when I was starting to work on this is something I learned from people here at the University of Chicago, particularly two of its greatest economists, Ronald Coase and George Stigler. Both of them have essays on something which they call the market for ideas, or the marketplace for ideas. And the question really is that at all a useful concept? Because it's a funny kind of market, right? Because there are no prices in that market. Nobody's buying and selling anything. And, both the supply and the demand curves are kind of, very different than what we usually have. And yet two of the greatest economists of the 20th century thought it was a useful concept. And when I go to give a talk, and I mentioned this to an audience of historians, which I do every once in a while, I immediately get jumped on. There's no such thing as the marketplace for ideas. And I think it is a useful concept because we use markets for things that aren't actually commodities. Gary Becker here had a marriage market, right? So now there's no obvious. It has many characteristics that are sort of weird, but it's still a useful concept. But here is what I want to point out: when I come to an audience or I have a conversation with somebody and I have a new idea, and I want to convince that person of something important, like the Enlightenment. And at the end, that person nods and says, Joel, yeah, you're right. I mean, this is a really good point. Usually an undergraduate, as you might imagine. Graduate students don't listen to me, but undergraduates, if there's a couple they're sitting over there, they don't listen, but that's fine. But then I have, so to speak, if I convince somebody that my theorem is correct, or that the planet I discovered is really there, or the microbe that I think caused that disease is really, I have made a sale. Now, I don't get paid for that in money, but there is a market there in which I supply a new idea and somebody else buys it. So there is some kind of a market, and the reward system is funny, but it's there. Now, markets need rules. And that is, I think, the great insight of Douglas North and the institutionalist schools. That markets they need certain rules without which they can't exist, and somebody has to enforce these rules. And what happened, I think, in Europe at the end of the Middle Ages, in part driven by the printing press, in part driven by better postal systems, that something emerged that set the rules for the market for ideas to work. That's something. That institution, sometimes known as the Respublica Literaria, or the Republic of Letter, and they actually set rules about how the market for ideas would work. Now, did that market fail many times? Of course, lots of bogus theories. I can tell you long stories about them in medicine, in history, all kinds of crazy things around. But in the end, that market worked when they saw somebody who had it right. A Copernicus, a Galileo, a Newton, a Kepler,
But wait, was it a market? It's not so much as a technology. At some point, when your printing press is invented and this notion disseminates, as you pointed out, it's not a market in the usual sense. These are not private goods that are excludable. What they are is a bunch of ideas you cast out there, and if the technology expands to make it possible for all these other participants to enter into the debate, and they have the freedom to do so, that seems to me to be more than the analogy than just a market.
And so,
yeah,
you
go
just
ahead.
said the magic word, namely that they're free to enter.
But what I'm trying to argue is that the rules of this market emerged somewhere between 1450 and 1600, and that in the end the market worked reasonably well, far from perfect, but reasonably well. One of the great axioms of that market, and that's something that came up implicitly in what Jim Heckman was saying, is the principle of contestability. That is to say, there are no sacred cows. The slogan of the Royal Society, when they were established in 1662, is in nullius verba, meaning on no one's word. Don't take anybody's word for it. Everything is contestable. And even the great Newton himself was contested and was found to have made errors, not so much in the Principia, in the optics, never mind. But there were no sacred cows. Ever since Einstein came up with his relativity papers in the beginning of the 20th century, people have been trying to refute him. They haven't been successful so far, but it is contestable, and that, I think, is something really important. There are no sacred cows. The wisdom of Aristotle or Galenus or Hipparchus, or you name it, all this, every single one of these guys was questioned, tested, and when found wanting, tossed overboard unceremoniously.
But it wasn't a market.
I think, is the greatness of a market for idea that really works. And we continue to do it. And, the Republic of Letters seems to have vanished from the lexicon in the late 18th century. But it's still here, ladies and gentlemen. We're all part of it because we're selling ideas. Deirdre is selling liberalism, and I'm selling the Enlightenment, and Jim Robinson is selling Africa. We're all selling things. And we hope to make converts, because if you convince enough people, there is a payoff. Some of that payoff is intrinsic. You get warm glow for being famous and cited. And sometimes, you get appointed to the American Academy. You get, there's this prize that I can't remember its name now, Jim. That some people win. But that is what the name of this game is. And it works. Because it has created, I think, in the end, the great enrichment. And having the rules right and having the institutions right really is crucial. And when you have the rules wrong, and I'll give you a counterexample just to drive it home. Who gets the rules wrong? China gets the rules wrong, in the sense that they don't produce anything like what the West produces, because the market for idea in China is basically completely confined to the Keiju imperial examination. That is what every intellectual, every ambitious young lad in China has to study for, are the same, basically, books for which everybody studies in order to do well, pass the exams.
Wait, that's obsolete. The PISA scores, I think, are far more important in China these days than this exam you just cited. So,
yes, that's right. It's the same deal. But I don't think that institutions arise except from experiment. From the very idea of intellectual inquiry in a society. And for that to work, there's got to be free entry and exit. So it's the freedom of entry, I think. As I was saying in my talk, that's the key here. And in fact, it's the same thing in economics and in the economy. If you blockade entry, and this is one of my problems with your to talk about the patent system. If you blockade entry from my office at the Cato Institute, I can see K Street, where all these obstacles to entry are created, and it's so irritating. I curse them from my office. So free entry means a free society, getting beyond the hierarchies. Now there's a danger, Jim, I think you'll agree, that these institutions that you quite properly praise in Africa, which incidentally I would claim existed in societies such as England in the Middle Ages as well. There's a danger, don't you agree? I'm going to ask you this, that they become conservative in ways that are not good for the ordinary person. Is that commonplace, or is it? I suppose it happens occasionally, but isn't that a problem?
Yeah, I think that's a long conversation. I would say, what I would say is that, in my experience, many types of institutions or political institutions, that look very non-Western are nevertheless legitimate to the people in those societies. We have this particular idea of what legitimate state and institutions look like, which is often out of sync with African traditional institutions, and it's very difficult for us to understand how they themselves think about them. So sure, they can be conservative, but that's that's also because people's traditions are challenged and people's traditions are kind of rejected and vilified, and so that creates a sort of conservatism.
Yeah, but is there also a chance that they, like my example of the K Street, can they be used for corrupt purposes as well?
Well, that's not a word I use. I think what I'm trying to emphasize more is those systems were kind of created with a logic, and a normative order, and they can be recreated, they can be recreated to do different things,
Like what?
Like promote economic development in the case of Rwanda. That's a very traditional system of social relations that has been leveraged to kind of do something completely different from what it was in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was mostly used to mobilize people to fight in wars.
I've accused you of being a statist, and I want to see if I'm wrong. I'll withdraw the term if it's not. Now, how would it apply to? How would these African principles, which I admire, I've heard them spoken about in South Africa, And as I say, I think you may be exaggerating how peculiarly African they are, although I'm struck by your vocabulary point, which is very interesting. But how do they apply to a modern industrial society? Can we move? Now, here's what I'm trying to trap you into saying. I'm hoping you'll say, yes, we can apply these same principles by having the state encourage them in the West. We can have, for example, we can admire the German system where the workers have representatives on the board. Now, is that the kind of thing you would recommend for us?
I'm not recommending anything. I'm just.
Well, no,
I'm just trying to understand the world. I don't have a policy agenda.
Yeah, but I have an advantage, dear. I've read your books and you haven't read mine, and I know that you do recommend expansion of the state. And if I have to admit that your colleague Acemoglu is even more enthusiastic and seems to be becoming more and more enthusiastic.
Well, he's not here, so let's not talk about him.
Here, but you are, and
I think we point out that if you look at our book, The Narrow Corridor, we point out there are these very different paths, and some of those paths involve states that are inimical to development and destroy development,
yes, sure.
And other parts of the world do not have states. And they're not very developed, and in the middle, there's a sort of balance where the state and society kind of co-evolve. So a state emerges which is accountable and kind of controlled by society, and I think my sense of the data is that those are the places in the world which are the most prosperous today.
Yeah,
So how does it emerge, though? Could you elaborate that a little bit? I think it'd be useful.
There's a whole book on this.
I know, but a quick paragraph summary. I mean, what principles? Is it liberty? I mean, what aspect of it is?
That's what
she would say liberty.
What happens in the book, and here what happens in this fine book, it's a wonderful book called The Narrow Corridor, is that he and Acemoglu say that larger state action brings freedom. And it's an extraordinary claim, which I was trying to, in my
But it's a very conditional claim. It's conditional on the governance of the state. It's not a blanket assertion about the state. It's about the state and the governance of the state at the same time. So I think that's what distinguishes it from your generalization.
What keeps these governments in line? Because I think all three of us agree that most governments in history have been extractive, and for the cousins, right? And sub-Saharan Africa has a sad history of this, but so did Europe for hundreds of years. So it's not as if it's something about people with black skin or something. So what ideology keeps people on the narrow path?
I think there's a lot of variation, actually, in historical states, in how they were organized and how extractive they were. I don't think, for example, if you look at the history of states in Mesoamerica, some of them, ended up being very extractive, like the Inca state, but that wasn't true of many of the Mesoamerican states, the Zapotec state or Teotihuacan.
I agree with you.
I think, it was not true of many states that emerged in Africa historically, because Africans managed to create many mechanisms for stopping despotism.
Or in Greece, for that
there was no feudalism in Africa outside of Ethiopia. Yeah. So I think different parts of the world had different histories, and all I'm trying to say is we need to take those histories kind of much more seriously than we do.
But here is something that you need to worry about a little bit, Jim, and I think you were moving a bit fast there, obviously. But you started off with China, and then you went on to Africa. But in fact, they share something, which is neither of them had this sort of Scottish drive toward economic growth, this sort of dynamic in which you want to improve things at all costs. But here is the problem, and this is the problem that both Ming Qing China over 500 years ran into, and many of your African states, and that is, you want stability. You want something that works, that can reproduce itself, in which whatever was will stay. And that's fine if you are insulated from the rest of the world. But the tragedy of both Africa and China is that they were Europeans. And then the question is, how resilient are these institutions to the fact that the Europeans come in there with their machine guns and their antibiotics and their ideas about democracy, and how many of them can somehow protect their institutions and their customs from this onslaught
are you saying that these Chinese institutions left alone would have developed to this kind of degree of prosperity?
I would doubt it very much. I would doubt it that if it hadn't been for the shock that China got during the Opium Wars and during their need to rely on Western help during the Taiping Rebellion, and if it hadn't been for the American ships showing up in Tokyo Harbor, that both Japan and China, in all likelihood, would have continued to go on as they had been for hundreds of years. But the shock of being confronted with the West, so Europe is the troublemaker in the globe. I mean, Europeans, because of the kind of things that I was talking about earlier, developed the kind of tools and the kind of things that the rest of the world, couldn't quite cope with. And they changed in different ways. I mean, Japan responds in one way, and they become, more Western than the Western themselves. They even proposed to start speaking German. God help me if that would happen.
Really?
But China responds in a different way, and Africa responds in a different way, and in fact, different parts of Africa respond in a different way.
Yeah.
But they all have to cope with the onslaught of Western technology, Western science, Western medicine,
but also the onslaught of the Enlightenment is what you're saying.
So that depends a great deal. Some places have actually adopted many ideas of the Enlightenment, including democracy, freedom of speech. You look at countries that, for better or for worse, have been able to do that, and others have not. I mean, I find this really striking. Why is it, for instance, that in India, despite everything, some model of democracy has now been has survived, for over 70 years.
Sure.
In Pakistan next door, nothing of the kind, and then Iran, even less so. And so the Enlightenment is obviously sort of an acquired taste. Not everybody acquired it.
But I as I said, I object to using the word enlightenment in this connection. It's liberalism that's the key here, and that's what.
Well, let's call it the liberal enlightenment.
Well, that'll solve it. That'll solve it. But if you were to join me in using that phrase, then I would have no objection to you attaching science to it, and progress of that sort. I should point out, by the way, that science is not the source of modern economic growth to begin with. It simply isn't. It's small potatoes. Yeah, you understand the motion of the spheres better than you did in the old days, after you have Copernicus and so forth. But as far as useful knowledge is concerned,
no. Deirdre, our advantage is you've read my books and I've read yours, but I disagree with them. Not with that point.
We're old friends and we love each other. I want you to know that.
I want to say, I think, obviously, I agree with you, Joel. That's why I had the photograph of the Maxim guns at the Battle of Omdurman on that slide. But I think that's not the point. It's true that you can't expect, societies in other parts of the world to have anticipated what was going to happen, as a consequence of Western expansion.
Yep.
But the point is, now, look at what South Korea did. South Korea was a Japanese colony, look at it, look what it did. It reorganized itself and turned itself. Look at the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates was part of the Trucial States. In 1965, the Sultan of Abu Dhabi didn't have electricity in his palace. Look at what they've achieved since then. And they've done it, with a very traditional, leveraging very traditional mechanisms and social institutions. So I think, my point is just that, now, thankfully, the Western Europe is not invading other parts of the world, and they're independent, and they have some space, to kind of reorganize themselves. And the ways in which they do that are kind of quite surprising, given the conventional wisdom, it seems to me, So I guess that's my point.
They're not originating ideas. They're borrowing new technology and they become more open to it. But if we go back to the original question about what created this wealth,
Yes.
I'm not sure that that is relevant.
Well, as Jim said, and there I completely agreed with you, that the scientific question of what caused the original beginning of economic growth is quite separate from how it then gets used.
Sure. Percolation, imitation.
Gets borrowed. And there's a tendency to get these two questions mixed up. For example, in your book, the other book of yours I've read, which is
Why Nations Fail.
Yes, Why Nations Fail. What we need to know for the first question is why one nation, or actually as this person raised in Holland will agree, the Dutch and the English, why they succeeded. Not, as is famously said, happy families are all pretty much the same. Unhappy families are unhappy in their own way. So this matter of cross-country comparison now between, why Botswana does much better than Zimbabwe, to take an obvious...
But I actually think that what Jim was saying, that at least in economic development, happy families are all happy in their different ways, because there are different ways of reaching economic growth. That was sort of the lesson that he took from Gerschenkron.
Gerschenkron, who was my teacher.
Who was your teacher, so you should know this. But I think that there's something there, and I think, wondered for a very long time to what extent technological dynamism can actually be sustained in a state in which there isn't anything that looks like a free market for ideas. So let me make an interesting point, just comparing China with the West. So let me just finish this, Deirdre, because I think it's an important point, and it answers the question that you raised. And that is this. We know that China went through an era of very powerful, dynamic technological progress. This is the late Tang and Song dynasties, roughly speaking, between 800 and about 1279 AD, and before the conquest of the Mongols. Now, what is interesting is you look at, in detail, who the inventors are in China. There are almost every single one of them is a government official, is a civil servant. In other words, the government basically expects from the smartest and most creative of its mandarins to produce new ideas and to build, mechanical clocks and introduce new varieties of rice and, hydraulic equipment. All this is done by government officials. And that actually worked really well for them until one day, maybe not so much during the Mongol rule, but after that, during the Ming dynasty, the government lost interest. And it basically told these administrators, so I imagine, take it easy, we want stability, we don't want progress, and then it ends. Now, in the West, basically technological change and scientific progress, such as it is almost entirely carried out by private individuals. Okay,
well, that's not quite true.
The governments don't, not until the late 19th and early 20th century do governments really intervene.
These were princely astronomers. The court of Catherine the Great was filled with mathematicians and scientists. it's the same, interestingly, and here we have an interest in common. It's the same with German music, which is highly state encouraged, right? And it's
Patronage, you mean?
Yes,
That's different.
patronage.
Yeah, the state and noble patronage. Sure, you know, Galileo was the court philosopher at the Grand Duke of Tuscany, so the state, but you know, the Grand Duke of Tuscany did not tell him to invent. Basically, they said, go do your thing, you know, and we'll leave you alone as long as you don't do too crazy things, which he did. But that's
remember, I mean, it's highly decentralized, though.
But let me just finish.
And so Bach couldn't make it with a Brandenburg Concerto.
The point is,
couldn't get a job with that. It went elsewhere, though. It did pretty well.
This is a very important point. You speak about the free free knowledge. Well, that's the point. There has to be free entry. There's got to be a liberal idea deep in it. And when things really get going is when that idea that everyone in this room has equality of permission to go try out stuff and fail and succeed. That's the key that I don't know how to express this more clearly. It kind of supercharges your story.
Sure.
And as long as you're willing to agree with that, Joel and I are among the few economic historians who talk about the force of ideas at all. Our colleagues tend to talk about incentives, material incentives. He and I constitute a two-person ideational school of economic history.
There's a few newcomers, Deirdre, I got to tell you. Most of them are my graduate students, but yeah.
They are. He's been a... Shall we turn to the audience or what?
Yes, maybe we can turn to the audience. I think we were about all right. I was supposed to be given a warning, but I'm going to take the warning as myself, so we'll go forward. We have microphones.
We need microphones.
So here, the person right next to you, that's a natural place to start, yes.
Oh, hi. My name is Yang, graduate student in sociology. So from all the talk I've listened to, it appears that liberalism is an alien technology for this innovation machine, and it's very helpful. But since its beginning, liberal revolution, let's say from Dutch Revolution and the British one, there is always institution behind it. And given that in this year, education or four-year college is the biggest divide in election, much larger than, let's say, gender and class. So what do you think about the government's role in providing primary and secondary education, and whether it is private enterprise or government that can provide long-lasting, this innovative spirit?
I go with Jim on this. He's done very important work on on early child education, for instance, among other things. And the problem is that we don't know enough, I think Jim will agree, about what works. And so to rush in with the government and saying, well, we're going to have Head Start, and that's going to solve everything. Has Head Start solved everything? I don't think so. But look, I have a long-standing gripe about neo-institutionalism with both of my colleagues here. I think, look, go read the three versions of the Soviet Constitution. One in the 1920s, one in the 30s, one in the 1970s. Those are beautiful documents. They're liberal documents. And yet they were run by thugs. So institutions don't work without what you quoted, Jim, I think it was a passage from Aristotle, or was it Aristotle, in which one has to have, it's the Chinese.
The rippling up.
That's the one that I liked so much, because in this way it said individual ethics, changes in individual ethics are what make the institutions work or not.
We have.
The answer if you're...
Why don't we try a question from the upper gallery? We have one person.
Well, you'll have to speak loud then, dear.
Oh, no, they have a microphone.
A microphone, yeah.
I thought there was a
There's a mic.
Nobody's up? Okay, then we have questions here. Go ahead, please.
Hello, a question for Professor McCloskey. So I do not want to be seen as supporting the boogeyman that is the state, but my question here for you is that, well, what should the role of the state be? And furthermore, you showed in your graph that clearly having too much liberalism can lead to a society in misery. So then what liberties do we give up?
Well, it's very much an empirical question, dear. Think about that crossing of the two lines that I called now. It's a factual, empirical question which way we're going, right? And it's not unresearchable. I think that we're going down. And some of my friends here think that, well, no, things aren't so bad that half of national income goes through the state. And I want to warn them that we might be going in the other way. And it's a question of fact. Neither you nor I is an anarchist. I was once an anarchist, but I gave that up as I abandoned socialism as well.
May I just make one small remark? I mean, one of the most famous gags in American political folklore was cited earlier by Deirdre. This is a famous statement by Ronald Reagan, who said, you know, the 6 most dangerous words. How many? I am from the government, and I'm here to help you. But let me tell you something. The day after Hurricane Katrina, a lot of people were sitting there and hoping for somebody from the government to come and help them.
And how did that work out, Joe?
And the same was true after, you know, the great earthquake of Lisbon of 1755. And there were times in which there were people from the government who did not come to help you. For instance, in the Irish potato famine, and 1.5 million people died because the British government did not come to help them. So I would say there are times in human history when I'm from the state and I'm from the government, I'm here to help you, people hug them. Even, I should say, in Texas.
But would people have lived in the flood zones of Katrina had there not been the guarantee that they would be rescued?
That's right.
I mean, that's what you're getting back to in this.
A guarantee provided by the Army Corps of Engineers, which said these dikes, will never be overtopped.
And that's why the very wise Douglas North once told me that government and society have a bad marriage. They can't live without each other, and they can't live with each other.
He was experienced in bad marriages. I don't mean Joe.
That's unfair.
No, not Joe, but
that's
Doug
unfair.
was.
Not even Doug.
Okay, go ahead. Rick Hornbeck.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for the great discussion. I guess one thing I think I took, and it was a great reminder from James Robinson, is this idea that sort of stability can itself be, an objective that people would get a lot of value from, even setting aside growth. Because I think I came into this kind of wanting to learn something about, well, what is going to give us growth? What is going to make the world better off? And I think just the reminder that, sometimes people want stability in life, even independent of growth, was, I think, an interesting reminder. And then reflecting on then what that meant, I think, for the other comments also, it seems to be finding the right balance between stability and instability. I think Deirdre would kind of agree that maybe one of the core roles of this state is creating this stable environment with protection of property rights and enforcement of sort of rule of law in certain ways, so that there is like a stable environment for private enterprise to innovate, to create growth. But then you see with that disruption comes chaos, worries about AI and technological unemployment and all the concerns throughout time of, new technologies get introduced, people are going to be unemployed, it's going to be disruptive, we should shut that down. And so, I guess just like reflecting on what is like the optimal balance between sort of stability and instability, even providing some stability, some safety net could encourage people to innovate. I don't know if some of the grad students in the audience might be envious of those of us with tenure that we can sit back and try to innovate and do something very different. When you're facing that sort of instability, you have to have a paper in a year or two or something like that. Maybe you don't feel like you can take a huge home run swing. You need to be a little safer. And so, maybe innovation, maybe people with tenure just get lazy and don't do much, or maybe, they can really then, maybe even be more innovative in some way. So I think I'd just be curious on what you all would reflect on this trade-off between sort of stability and instability, and kind of what the role of society or government would be in sort of creating that right balance between.
Well, I would only observe that on the flag of Brazil are the words order and progress. And that's exactly what you're pointing out.
Can I say something about that? I don't think I'd really use the language of stability. There's a beautiful paper that I teach by Stanley Tambaya, who was an anthropologist at Harvard, another anthropologist. Why am I talking about all these anthropologists? Because I learned 30 years ago that if you want to actually learn something about the rest of the world, the only place where there's real knowledge and wisdom is in the anthropology and history literatures. You can't read economics books if you actually want to learn anything about. No, I'm serious. You can't. You can't.
Hear, hear.
You can't.
I'm much more sympathetic with that view than you might think, Jim.
So, Tambaya wrote this article. It's a sort of seminal paper about the kind of history of state formation in Southeast Asia. And he points out that many polities, the Thai traditional kingship in particular, were organized according to what he calls a galactic polity, that the state was actually organized as a sort of mirror image of the cosmos, and kind of not just metaphorically, but actually administratively and kind of institutionally, it was meant to mirror this mandala, which was so like, how do I, I don't know that's about stability. It's about sort of your values and about what gives you meaning, what gives meaning to that society. And I think, for me, that's how I'd sort of think about African society. Jim Heckman was talking about, everyone salt tax and everyone wanting to truck barter and exchange. I guess my first comment would be, well, salt tax was talking about Guatemala, so maybe what's relevant in Guatemala is not relevant elsewhere in the world. I think you're actually right, by the way. I agree with that. But I think what you see is that many societies put barriers and create impediments. And let me give you a very specific example from Nigeria. So I was once having a discussion with a friend of mine at the University of Nigeria about land, about factor markets. So historically in Africa, there were no factor markets. There were no land markets. There were no labor markets. There was not really a capital market except in a few places on the coast, etc. Okay, so you think that was a crazy thing. So we were talking about this, and he said, come with me, let's go. So we drove outside the university. We went to his family's compound outside the university in Nsukka, the town is called. And he said, you see that? And I said, what is that? He said, that's my father's grave. And next to him, that's my grandfather's grave. And next to him, that's my great-grandfather's grave. How could I sell this land? My ancestors are buried under it. So I don't know if stability is the right word for thinking about that. I think that's a very different kind of normative order. So you may say that's inimical to progress or whatever, and perhaps it is, but I guess my point about South Korea, or the United Arab Emirates or Botswana or Rwanda is these societies can reorganize themselves on their own terms.
Look, you're joining me, and I'm I'm very glad to hear this. In what I call, and a few others, Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson and a few others call humanomics. That is, we don't throw away the logic which I taught for 12 years at the University of Chicago of incentives and entry and exit into markets, but that we also respect, you might even say, the cultures of people. And by this I mean integrating sociology, anthropology, politics, and history and literature into our understanding of economies. And I think you would agree with this. I'm not so sure that Joe will.
Well, I'm not so sure either. I do want to point out
Did I predict that?
that to describe the same phenomenon, if you really like it, you call it stability. If you don't like it, you call it stagnation. But it's the same thing.
Yeah, well, sometimes.
And what I find interesting is that in many societies that I regard, at least most of the data show that there is stagnation going on, at the end they sort of look around and say, why are we asleep when the rest of the world is moving forward? Yeah. And so a classic example is what happened in the Netherlands in the Golden Age and the century after, the 18th century. So the 18th century is generally thought to be a period of Dutch, both cultural and economic stagnation. Not decline, not collapse, just stability. And at the end of the century, the Dutch books all say, what happened to us, How come we were once the leaders of Europe and now we are, completely superseded by England, by later on by Belgium, everybody's overtaking us. Very similar things you see in late Qing China. For the Manchu emperors, the Qing dynasty, they were all in favor of stability. That's what they wanted. And you see, particularly after 1860, the Chinese saying, we are failing. Look at us. And then, of course, it gets worse and worse because Japan is moving ahead and, they get clobbered left, right, and center. And there's this sense of, hey, where have we been all this time? This stability has been terrible for us. And that's precisely what the point I was making earlier, which is stability is nice and well if you living in a neighborhood in which everybody is like you. But if you're like Spain, say, which is, very stable, very stagnant, for many, many decades, and and eventually they sort of wake up, and there's Napoleon knocking on their door and say, hey, I'm going to bring you progress. Didn't work in that case, but that is the tragedy of human history, which is you have neighbors.
But Jim and I want to emphasize that there's human meaning involved. I've almost completed a book on English open fields and enclosures, which I hope both of you will read, which I once called The Prudent Peasant, by which I meant maximize utility subject to constraints. And now I call it the prudent and faithful peasant. Faithful. It's human meaning is constructed in our economies, and this is what humanomics is about. We aren't turning economics into anthropology. We're trying to supplement both anthropology and economics with, so to speak, each other.
Okay, we have one last question. I will defer to. Oh, what? So maybe two last questions. Sorry.
Sorry, I have a question to Professor Robinson.
Oh.
I find your argument very inspiring. That to think about stop thinking about like there's one universal rule of the human origin. Stop thinking about like the individualized property right is a starting point. Some societies emphasize redistribution, collectivism, equality more than property right. I find that very inspiring, and it really, to me, feels like it can explain where we're from and where we're at. But do you think, especially facing the tremendous inequality of wealthy distribution between the global south and north. Do you think these countries who emphasize the distribution, they're at the steady states? Still like, they're like, are they gonna, like, yeah, I guess my question is like, will they still be in this steady states? Or do you predict they are going to have some convergence to maybe the Western society because of,
I mean, if you're asking, do I think countries in the global south are in steady state, I think the answer is surely no. I mean, I was thinking about the Hurricane Katrina and people wanting the government to come and help them. Nobody would think like that in Nigeria. Nobody would expect the government to do anything, and nobody would want the government to do anything either. And the government wouldn't do anything. So, and the national government in Nigeria is a sort of alien entity. Nobody thinks like, we look at that and we say, why can't they make this thing accountable? That's not anyone's impulse. Like my favorite example of that is in Igbo. If you take the Igbo word, let's say you get a job in Abuja in the National Civil Service, okay? You'll become a government functionary. The literal translation of the word for civil servant in Igbo is white man's job. Today.
That's wonderful.
And I think that says something, it's so alien, So that problem has to be solved. It has to be solved. That creates lots of problems, that I could talk about. But I think that's a feature of the post-colonial world, in many, many places,
It was a feature of the pre-modern European world, too. Nobody thought of the government as a nice helper in the 16th century. They were terrified of governments, quite properly.
One more question here. We've had a very patient.
You both have talked about the market for ideas. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Barely.
Okay. I'm trying to talk in loudly. Okay. We go back to the late 20th century, and the market for ideas then, when we were in graduate school, was pretty straightforward. We found an idea, and we found a way to do it. But today, the market of ideas, I'm not sure, is so easy. It seems you want to abolish the National Institute of Health and the NSF.
That'd be a good start.
No, Deirdre, I knew you were going to interrupt me, by the way. I knew it. But what's a substitute for that? All four of you are at private institutions of a kind, and you're very well supported in terms of the things you do, and you get prizes and so forth, which is fine. But I think you think about the private enterprise, the Cato Institute, so forth. These ideas are now being supported by private institutions at very expensive ways for these people to try to get into an idea unless they are in the right place, writing the right grants. The right grants have to agree with the people. And I'm wondering if you two would just comment about your feelings about the rules that are now taking place relative to when we started, which I thought was a simpler time and it was much easier. And I think the market for ideas has become difficult where Gates can decide what done in Africa.
That was always the case. I mean, people talk about the market, free entry to the market for ideas. But look, I mean, you are living anyway, say, take Europe in the 16th century, which had a vibrant market for ideas, okay? But in order to come up with an idea, you had to, at the very least, know Latin, read and write, go to a university, and have the funds to support you there.
Sure.
And that ruled out 90 or 95% of the population, okay? And so this is all about upper tail of the human capital distribution. There is no question about it. It's like that everywhere. The idea that everybody has equal permission to enter the market for idea, in theory, looks really well. But for you to actually express your idea in writing and formulate it in the right language, that requires a background, it requires an education, and that means resources, it means access, it means lineage, it means all kinds of things. What is interesting about the 16th and 17th century, that in fact most of the great thinkers and people making breakthroughs did not come from the very top of society. They were not the noblemen, they were middle class. But the middle class in 16th, 17th century Europe is, is narrow. I mean, most people are peasants. Yeah. And from the peasantry, every once in a while, maybe there is, some diamond in the rough. But roughly speaking, it is extremely rare. And it was always thus, and it will always be thus. I mean, the barriers to entry are there. But within the group that has entry, okay, I think Deirdre is right. Permission to express yourself and be and come up with your idea is important, but the notion that this applies to the population at large is laughable.
But I agree with you. This is another very old friend of mine. I agree with you, Sam. And what we need is the principle of equality of permission. We just need the principle, and we need to keep preaching it to each other. That's freedom of entry. And that doesn't mean equal opportunity. That's not what can be achieved. But we can achieve taking away the hooks and chairs in the way. A concrete example, Steve Ziliak and I, who's right there, have worked on the misuse of tests of statistical significance. And we gave a talk, I remember it very well. Was it at Georgia, Steve, or it was down there somewhere, close to the national... where the CDC employees were? Yeah, that was Georgia Tech, and Steve and I said, as Jim will agree, tests of statistical significance without a loss function are meaningless, without a substantive loss function. And two guys came up to us after the meeting and said, we agree, but we've just come over from the Center for Disease Control. Don't tell them that we came to your seminar. Now that's hooks and chairs. That was my mom's expression. Hooks and chairs in the way of women having jobs, or African Americans having jobs, or young people having jobs, are the hooks and chairs are created by these institutions that my friends here admire so much, and those are often state institutions, and they stop people from actually criticizing this absurd statistical procedure that Steve especially and I have uncovered in scientific procedures.
I think you have one last question. Okay, I'm a very bad moderator. I'd go all night.
Yeah,
I don't set limits. I like the idea of exchange.
So just for both of you. So
wait for the microphone, dear. Then everyone can hear you.
Oh, I thought it was loud enough. All right. So I've heard about liberalism being a driver for the Industrial Revolution and the growth that we see now. Yeah. Then you said then enlightenment, right, or industrial enlightenment,
yeah,
right. But I think that the role of colonization was conveniently left out, right. So I'm just curious to see what you guys think. If your theories would still hold up if, say, colonization never happened.
I think, yes, I think it would certainly. I don't think modern prosperity has anything to do with colonization. I think colonies were terrible. I wish people who are melanin disadvantaged like I am had not embarked on these stupid expeditions to the east and conquering people. But I don't think there was any great gain from it for the Europeans. I don't just think that. I and a number of other people have made calculations to ask how big it is, and it turns out to be quite small. What mattered was, for economic growth, is ideas, as Joe and I agree. So both of us, and to some extent I think Jim would agree, what we should be looking into is not delta K, as we say in economics, but the environment for ideas. And the unfree societies don't do well in this matter. And they don't, as Jim pointed out, they're often not very innovative. In any case, the idea that everyone should have free entry, that is equality of permission, is, I think, the core liberal idea. And you can say that, well, we have our customs and we want to keep them. But then, as Joel said, people often find that they regret that in the end.
I just want to add one thing. I mean, the debate about imperialism and colonization goes back a century and a half at least. And I think Deirdre and I basically agree that the effect of colonization and European imperialism and exploitation caused huge damage to many of the victims, and particularly, of course, in Africa, and where we know that the slave trade actually led to very substantial economic decline. And there is also, I think, a serious argument to be made that even, say, for India, where, of course, no slaves were taken, but that the fact that they were essentially dominated by British policies and subjected to British supplies did leave a deep scar in the Indian economy. That does not mean that for the West this was essential. And I think this actually Adam Smith made this point better than anybody before or after him. But the fact of the matter is now, I'll make one important point, and that is Europeans, ever since the late 15th century, have been exploring the world for all kinds of reasons, for conquest, but also for proselytizing Christianity, for looking for gold, for stealing, for ripping off natives, killing them if they could, whatever. But the actual effect on Europe wasn't the treasures that they got, but it is the knowledge that they picked up in the New World. And what I mean by knowledge here is not something that's written down, but for instance, crops. So two of the major nutritional crops in Europe, potatoes and maize, were imported from the New World, as was a whole host of other things. One of the examples I always like to tell is a tree bark, conchana trees, that actually helped mitigate the effect of malaria. And so here is a true story. The malaria drug was brought in from South America to Europe by Spanish priests. And it worked against malaria. Not great, but it alleviated the symptoms. When Oliver Cromwell was lying on his deathbed, dying from malaria, they told him, you should take the cinchona bark because it helps. And he says, I will not touch a papist drug. And he died. Couldn't happen to a nicer guy. All right.
Okay, I hate to turn it off, but I think maybe this is a good time. We can stay around privately. If you guys want to stay the night here, we can have private discussions. But I want to thank the speakers today. I think it's an interesting discussion. And thank the Becker Friedman Institute in particular for sponsoring this event.